The first sensation that pierced through the fog of unconsciousness was pain, a sharp, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from every fiber of her being. Slowly, awareness crept back like dawn breaking through storm clouds, and she became conscious of cold stone beneath her cheek, the musty scent of earth and dampness filling her nostrils. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy as she struggled to open them, and when she finally managed to lift them, she was greeted by impenetrable darkness. Where was she? The question echoed through her mind, but no answer came. More disturbing still was the realization that she couldn't remember who she was. Panic began to claw at her chest as she tried to sit up, her limbs trembling with weakness. The movement sent waves of nausea rolling through her stomach, and she had to pause, breathing deeply to steady herself. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she could make out the rough-hewn walls of what appeared to be a cave or underground chamber. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the distance, each drop echoing like a metronome counting away moments she couldn't recall. She pressed her palms against the cold stone floor and pushed herself upright, noting with growing alarm that she was wearing nothing but a tattered white dress that looked like it had been through a war. Blood stained the fabric in several places, though she couldn't tell if it was hers or someone else's. The metallic scent of it mixed with something else, something wild and primal that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. "You're awake." The voice came from the shadows, deep and resonant with an authority that made her wolf immediately respond with recognition, though her human mind remained blank. She spun toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs as a figure emerged from the darkness. He was tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that caught what little light filtered into the chamber and eyes that seemed to glow with an otherworldly intensity. Everything about him screamed danger, from the predatory grace of his movements to the way he seemed to command the very air around him. Yet something deep within her, some primal part of her being, whispered that this man was important, that he meant something to her. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears. The stranger's expression softened slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something that might have been pain flickering across his features before his mask of control slipped back into place. He approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal, his hands visible and non-threatening. "My name is Marcus," he said, his voice gentle despite its underlying power. "Marcus Blackwood. And you? You are Alina. Alina Ashworth." The name meant nothing to her, felt foreign on her tongue when she tried to repeat it silently. But the way he said it, with such careful reverence, made her wonder what she had meant to him, and what he meant to her. The bond between them hummed like a live wire, undeniable and electric, even as her memories remained frustratingly out of reach. Marcus helped her to her feet, his touch sending sparks of electricity through her skin that she couldn't understand or explain. Her legs shook beneath her weight, and she gratefully accepted his steady support as he guided her toward what appeared to be an opening in the cave wall. "Easy," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "You've been unconscious for 3 days. Your body needs time to recover." 3 days. The information hit her like a physical blow, raising 1,000 questions she couldn't voice. As they moved through a narrow tunnel that opened into a larger cavern, she found herself studying his profile in the flickering light of torches mounted on the walls. His features were sharp and aristocratic, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a scar that somehow seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen it before. The cavern they entered was clearly inhabited, furnished with rough wooden furniture and furs thrown across stone ledges to serve as beds. Other figures moved in the shadows, men and women whose eyes glowed briefly in the torchlight, revealing their wolf nature. They watched her passage with a mixture of curiosity and what might have been sympathy, their gazes lingering on her torn dress and obvious confusion. "Where are we?" she asked, settling gratefully onto a fur-covered seat that Marcus guided her to. "Safe," he replied, though the grimness in his tone suggested safety was a relative term. "This is one of my pack's safe houses. We brought you here after." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "After you were attacked." The word, attacked, sent a chill down her spine, but try as she might, She couldn't summon any memory of violence or danger. Her past remained locked away, hidden behind walls her mind had erected for reasons she couldn't fathom. As Marcus spoke with quiet authority to the other wolves in the cavern, Alina found herself studying the dynamics of the group with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. The way the others deferred to him, the subtle gestures of respect and submission, all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Marcus Blackwood was an alpha. The realization should have terrified her, given the stories she somehow knew about alpha wolves and their possessive, often violent nature. Instead, she felt an odd sense of rightness, as if some part of her had always known she belonged in the presence of such power. When he returned to her side, carrying a bowl of warm broth and a soft blanket, his movements held the fluid grace of a predator completely comfortable in his own skin. "Drink this," he said, settling beside her with careful attention to maintaining space between them while still remaining close enough to offer support. "It will help restore your strength." As she accepted the bowl with trembling hands, their fingers brushed, and the contact sent a jolt of recognition through her system that made her gasp. For just a moment she saw flashes, fragments of memory that came and went too quickly to grasp. A hand reaching for hers. Laughter echoing through moonlit woods. The taste of lips against her own. And through it all, the overwhelming sense of belonging, of being claimed and cherished and protected. "We're mates," she whispered, the knowledge arriving with sudden, crystal clarity even as the details remained frustratingly vague. Marcus's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "We are." But even as he confirmed what her wolf already knew, Alina sensed there was much more to their story, layers of complexity and pain that her missing memories held the key to understanding.
The broth was rich and warming, tasting of herbs and something indefinably wild that made her wolf settle contentedly. As she ate, Alina became aware of the curious glances from the other pack members, noting how they looked between her and Marcus with expressions she couldn't quite interpret. Some seemed pleased, others worried, and a few wore expressions of barely concealed hostility that made her shift uncomfortably. "They know me," she observed quietly, setting down the empty bowl. "Some of them don't seem happy to see me alive." Marcus's expression darkened, and she caught a glimpse of the alpha authority that could crush opposition without mercy. "There are those who question my judgment," he admitted, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby wolves find urgent business elsewhere. "They don't understand the full situation."
"What situation?" Alina pressed, feeling stronger now that she'd eaten but more confused than ever. The pieces of her existence felt scattered like a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing, leaving her with only glimpses of a picture she couldn't comprehend. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words with the care of someone walking through a minefield. "You were taken," he said finally. "Kidnapped from our territory by wolves who wanted to use you against me. When we found you, you'd been..." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "You'd been hurt, tortured. Your mind retreated to protect itself from the trauma." The explanation felt both true and incomplete, leaving her with the sense that crucial details were being carefully omitted. But why would he lie to her? What could be so terrible about their past that he felt the need to shield her from it, even now when she was clearly desperate for answers about who she was and how she'd ended up broken and alone in that dark cave? As the days passed in the underground sanctuary, Alina found herself growing stronger physically, though her memories remained as elusive as smoke. She began to move freely through the cavern system, exploring the network of tunnels and chambers that housed Marcus's displaced pack. It was during these wanderings that she first heard the whispers, fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when she appeared, meaningful glances exchanged when pack members thought she wasn't looking. "She doesn't remember," one woman murmured to her companion as Alina passed a shadowed alcove. "Maybe it's better that way." The other woman's response was too quiet to catch, but the tone carried weight that made Alina's stomach clench with unease. The whispers followed her everywhere, growing bolder as the speakers realized she couldn't recall whatever events had torn her life apart. She began to piece together fragments, mentions of a trial, arguments about justice and betrayal, references to choices that had torn the pack apart. Through it all, Marcus remained a constant presence, protective and attentive but increasingly evasive when she pressed for details about their shared history. "When will my memories return?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the central fire pit, watching flames dance across the cavern walls. His hand found hers in the darkness, the touch still sending those electric jolts through her system, but she noticed how he avoided her eyes when he answered. "The healer says they may come back gradually, or they may never return at all. Trauma affects every wolf differently." But even as he spoke the words of comfort, Alina caught something in his expression that suggested he might prefer her memories to remain buried forever. Sleep brought no peace to Alina's fractured mind. Her dreams were filled with shadows and half-remembered faces, voices calling her name with emotions that ranged from love to fury. She would wake gasping, her heart racing with the echoes of confrontations she couldn't quite grasp, arguments that seemed to tear at the very fabric of her being. In one particularly vivid dream, she stood in what appeared to be a great hall filled with wolves, their eyes glowing in the torchlight as a voice. Her own voice rang out with words of accusation and defiance. She woke from that dream with tears on her cheeks and Marcus's name on her lips, though she couldn't remember what role he'd played in the scene her subconscious had conjured. Marcus always seemed to know when the nightmares struck, appearing at her side with gentle hands and soothing words that gradually eased her back from the brink of panic. "It's just your mind trying to process trauma," he would tell her, stroking her hair until her breathing steadied. "Don't try to force the memories. Let them come in their own time." But Alina was beginning to suspect that her dreams weren't random trauma responses. They felt too coherent, too specific, like pieces of actual events her mind was trying desperately to communicate. The woman in her dreams stood proud and unbroken before a crowd of hostile wolves, speaking words of challenge and righteous anger. That woman bore her face but carried herself with a confidence and purpose that Alina couldn't imagine possessing. Who had she been before the darkness claimed her memories? And why did she sense that Marcus was more afraid of her remembering than he was of her staying lost? The pack's healer was an elderly woman named Sage, whose silver hair and keen eyes spoke of decades of tending to both physical and spiritual wounds. She examined Alina weekly, checking her physical recovery while carefully probing the barriers around her memory. During one such session, Alina worked up the courage to ask the questions that had been plaguing her. "Sage, the others look at me strangely, like they're afraid of me or afraid for me. What aren't they telling me?" The older woman's hands stilled in their gentle exploration of Alina's skull, and for a moment, silence stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap. "Memory is a funny thing, child," Sage said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Sometimes we lose memories because they're too painful to bear. Sometimes we lose them because others need us to forget." The cryptic response sent a chill down Alina's spine, and she caught the healer's wrist in a grip that was stronger than either of them expected. "What does that mean? What happened to me that everyone is so determined to keep hidden?" Sage's eyes met hers, and in them Alina saw a reflection of the same conflict she'd noticed in Marcus, the struggle between truth and protection, between honesty and kindness. "Some truths can destroy everything you've built," Sage whispered. "And some lies are told out of love. But the choice of which to embrace should always be yours." The healer's words echoed in Alina's mind long after their session ended, feeding a growing determination to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might prove to be. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, triggered by the simple act of helping with meal preparation. Alina was cutting vegetables alongside another woman when the knife slipped, opening a shallow cut across her palm. The scent of her own blood hit the air, and suddenly the world tilted sideways as memory crashed through her mental barriers like a dam bursting. She was standing in a moonlit clearing, her hands covered in blood that wasn't her own, while voices screamed accusations around her. "Murderer!" they cried. "Traitor!" And through it all, Marcus stood before her, his face a mask of anguish as he spoke words that cut deeper than any blade. "I have no choice, Alina. The pack demands justice." The vision lasted only seconds, but it left her gasping and shaking, the knife clattering to the cavern floor as the other woman rushed to support her. "Get Marcus," someone called, but Alina was already struggling to her feet, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd seen. Murder, betrayal, justice. The words echoed through her consciousness, carrying with them the weight of actions she couldn't yet remember but suddenly knew she'd committed. When Marcus arrived, his face pale with concern, she backed away from his reaching hands. "I killed someone," she whispered, the words falling like stones into the sudden silence of the cavern. "I murdered someone, and you condemned me for it." The pain that flashed across Marcus's features confirmed her suspicion, and she realized that her lost memories contained not just trauma, but guilt, and a betrayal that cut both ways. Marcus tried to approach her, his hands raised in a gesture of peace that only made Alina's panic spike higher. "Alina, please let me explain." But she was already moving, her newly awakened memories driving her toward the tunnel system with desperate urgency. She needed space, needed air, needed to escape the suffocating weight of revelations that changed everything she thought she knew about herself and her relationship with the Alpha who claimed to love her. Behind her, she could hear Marcus giving orders, his voice carrying the authority of a leader accustomed to immediate obedience, but she was beyond caring about pack hierarchy or proper behavior. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, branching into passages she hadn't explored before, but Alina followed her instincts, letting her wolf guide her toward what felt like escape. When she finally emerged into daylight, she found herself on a rocky ledge overlooking a vast forest that stretched to the horizon. The sun felt alien against her skin after days in the caves, but the fresh air helped clear some of the panic from her mind. She sank onto a boulder and tried to make sense of the fragment of memory that had shattered her carefully constructed sense of safety. If she was a murderer, why was Marcus protecting her? If she had betrayed his pack, why did he still claim her as his mate? And most troubling of all, if she was capable of taking a life, what else might she be capable of once her full memories returned? She wasn't alone on the ledge for long. Marcus found her within the hour, moving with the silent grace of a predator tracking prey, though his approach held none of the menace she might have expected from an alpha pursuing a wayward pack member. Instead, his expression was carefully controlled, hiding whatever emotions churned beneath the surface as he settled onto a nearby rock without permission or invitation. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching clouds cast shadows across the forest below while the weight of unspoken truths hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. "You remember something," Marcus said finally, his voice carefully neutral. It wasn't a question. He could probably sense the change in her, read the tension in her posture with the skill of someone who had known her intimately. Alina kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, afraid that looking at him would shatter what little composure she'd managed to cobble together. "I remember blood," she said quietly. "And accusations. And you." She finally turned to meet his gaze, seeing her own pain reflected in the depths of his dark eyes. "You stood there and let them call me a murderer. You chose them over me." The accusation hung in the air between them, and she watched something break behind his carefully maintained mask. "I chose justice," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him physical pain. "Even when it destroyed everything I held dear. Even when it meant losing you." The admission confirmed her worst fears while raising 1,000 new questions about the nature of the choice he'd been forced to make. "Tell me everything," Alina demanded, turning to face Marcus fully despite the way his presence made her wolf whine with confused longing. "No more protecting me from the truth. No more careful omissions. I need to know who I was and what I did." Marcus ran a hand through his dark hair, suddenly looking older than his years as he struggled with how much to reveal. "You were my Luna," he said finally. "My mate, my partner, the other half of my soul. You were also strong-willed and passionate, with a fierce sense of justice that sometimes put you at odds with pack traditions." Already Alina could sense the careful way he was choosing his words, revealing truth while still holding back the most damaging details. "The pack was different then," Marcus continued, his gaze distant as if he were seeing into the past. "Harsher. More traditional in ways that often meant might made right and the weak served the strong. You challenged those traditions, fought for changes that threatened the power structure many of the older wolves had built their lives around. Alina found herself leaning forward despite her wariness, drawn by the picture he was painting of a woman who sounded nothing like the confused, broken creature she felt herself to be now. "What changed?" she asked. "What happened that turned me from your Alina into someone the pack wanted to see punished?" Marcus's jaw tightened, and she saw him make some internal decision that shifted the very air around them. "You fell in love with someone else," he said quietly. "And when I tried to stop it, when I invoked the old laws to keep you bound to me, you killed him." The revelation hit Alina like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her wolf howl with anguish. She had been unfaithful. She had broken the sacred bond between mates, had fallen for another while bound to the alpha who sat before her now. Worse still, her betrayal had led to violence, to death, to the destruction of everything Marcus had built. "Who was he?" she whispered, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to face the magnitude of what she'd done. "A wolf from a neighboring pack," Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the pain she could see etched in every line of his face. "David Sterling. He was younger than me, idealistic, passionate about the same changes you wanted to see in our world." "You make it sound like I had good reasons," Alina said, anger beginning to burn through her shock. "But there's no excuse for betrayal, is there? No justification for breaking a mate bond." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of old wounds that had never properly healed. "Our bond wasn't chosen," he admitted. "It was arranged by our parents when we were children, a political alliance disguised as fated love. You never wanted it, never wanted me, but pack law gave you no choice." The explanation shifted something fundamental in Alina's understanding, adding layers of complexity to what had seemed like simple betrayal. If she'd been forced into a bond she never wanted, trapped by traditions that prioritized politics over personal choice, then perhaps her actions weren't as black and white as they'd first appeared. "The law was clear," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone reciting from memory. "Adultery by a mated female was punishable by death, especially when it threatened the stability of the pack. But you—" He paused, struggling with words that clearly cost him to speak. "You stood before the pack council and defended your actions. You said you'd found true love, that the bond between us was a prison you refused to live in any longer. And when I tried to use alpha authority to bring you back, when I threatened David—" Marcus's hands clenched into fists, and Alina could see the war between his human control and wolf instincts playing out across his features. "You didn't just kill him in passion or anger," Marcus said finally. "You planned it, made it look like self-defense. And you were good enough, smart enough, that you might have gotten away with it if not for witnesses." The picture he was painting grew darker with each revelation, but Alina found herself oddly relieved to finally understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She wasn't just a victim of trauma. She was someone who had made choices, taken actions, fought for what she believed in even when those beliefs led her down a dark path. "So you condemned me," she said, not really a question. "You chose pack law over your mate." Marcus's laugh was bitter and broken. "I tried to find another way. Spent weeks arguing with the council, looking for loopholes, anything that might save you. But in the end, I had to choose between you and the pack I'd sworn to protect. I chose duty over love." The admission hung between them like a confession of sins that could never be forgiven. "But I'm here," Alina pointed out, confusion cutting through her anger. "Alive with you in hiding. What changed?" Marcus's expression darkened, and she caught a glimpse of the ruthless alpha he could be when pushed beyond his limits. "The night before your execution you escaped," he said. "Somehow you managed to break free from the silver bonds that held you, killed 3 guards, and disappeared into the wilderness. The pack assumed you'd died out there. No one could survive alone in winter without a pack to support them." The pieces began clicking together in Alina's mind, forming a picture that was both more and less damaging than she'd feared. "But you found me," she continued, beginning to understand the true scope of what Marcus had done. "You tracked me down and brought me here, away from the pack that wanted me dead." Marcus nodded slowly, and she could see the weight of his decision etched in every line of his face. When I found you in that cave, broken and dying, I realized I couldn't let you go. Mate bond or not, arranged marriage or not, I loved you. I'd always loved you, even when you couldn't love me back. The confession was raw and honest, stripping away the careful control he'd maintained since her awakening. So I told the pack you were dead, gathered those loyal to me, and brought you here to heal. I chose you over duty, love over law. His words should have filled her with gratitude, but instead, Alina felt the weight of a debt she wasn't sure she could ever repay, especially knowing what her love, or lack thereof, had already cost him. As they made their way back to the cave system, Alina found herself looking at the pack members with new eyes. These weren't just Marcus's followers. They were wolves who had chosen to leave everything behind to support their alpha's decision to save her. Some had lost homes, families, status within the greater wolf community, all for a woman who couldn't even remember their sacrifice. The guilt was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that her actions had set all of this in motion. "How many came with you?" she asked quietly as they navigated the tunnel entrance. 43, Marcus replied. "Less than half my original pack, but more than I'd dared hope when I announced my decision to leave." "They hate me," Alina observed, remembering the hostile glances and whispered conversations that had followed her through the caves. "Some do," Marcus admitted. "They see you as the reason they lost their homes, their standing in the community. Others understand that love makes us do impossible things, that loyalty sometimes means following your alpha even when you disagree with his choices." They emerged into the main cavern to find several pack members waiting, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned to openly hostile. Alina squared her shoulders, feeling some echo of the woman she'd once been stirring within her. If she was going to live among these wolves, if she was going to be worthy of the sacrifice they'd made, she needed to face the consequences of her actions head-on. "I remember," Alina announced to the assembled wolves, her voice carrying across the cavern with surprising strength. The response was immediate. Gasps of shock, muttered conversations, and more than a few hands moving instinctively toward weapons. Marcus stepped closer to her side, his presence both protective and supportive, but he didn't try to speak for her. This was her moment, her choice to make. "I remember what I did, the choices I made, the lives that were lost because of my actions. I know why some of you hate me, and I know the sacrifices you've made because Marcus chose to save me rather than let justice take its course." The cavern fell silent except for the distant dripping of water and the crackle of the central fire. Alina could feel the weight of dozens of gazes upon her, judging, evaluating, waiting to see what kind of woman would emerge from the ashes of her lost memories. "I can't undo what I did," she continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I can't bring back the dead or restore what you've lost by following me into exile. But I can promise you this. I will spend whatever time I have left proving that Marcus's faith in me wasn't misplaced. I will earn my place among you, or I will leave so that you can return to the lives you deserve." The speech wasn't eloquent or polished, but it was honest, and she could see its effect rippling through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. The first wolf to step forward was a woman Alina vaguely remembered from her explorations. Tall, fierce-looking, with scars that spoke of battles survived and victories won. "Pretty words," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "But words are cheap, and we've already paid too high a price for your alpha's sentiment." Marcus tensed beside Alina, his alpha instincts responding to the challenge in the woman's tone, but Alina placed a restraining hand on his arm. This was her fight to have, her credibility to establish or lose. "You're right," Alina replied, meeting the woman's hostile gaze without flinching. "Words mean nothing without action to back them up. So tell me, what would it take for you to believe I'm worthy of the sacrifices you've made?" The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the predatory calculation of a wolf who had found her prey. "Combat," she said simply. "You claim to remember your past, remember the warrior you used to be. Prove it. Face me in the circle, and if you survive, maybe the rest of us will consider giving you a chance." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and Alina felt her wolf stir with interest despite her human mind's protests. She was still recovering, still fragmented, but some things were written too deeply in bone and muscle to be erased by trauma or time. "Alina, no," Marcus said, his voice carrying alpha authority that would have flattened most wolves into submission. But the scarred woman, Alina, merely smiled and tilted her head in a gesture that was respectful but unyielding. "With respect, Alpha, this isn't pack business. This is personal. Your mate has asked what it would take to earn our respect, and I've given her an answer. The choice is hers." All eyes turned back to Alina, and she could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her like a physical force. Part of her wanted to refuse, to find some other way to prove herself that didn't involve violence. But deeper instincts, older than thought or reason, were already preparing for battle. "When?" Alina asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Elena's smile widened, showing teeth that were slightly too sharp to be entirely human. "Now," she replied. "No time to prepare, no time to second-guess. Just instinct and skill. The way our ancestors settled disputes before laws and councils made everything complicated." The other pack members began moving without being asked, forming a rough circle in the center of the cavern, while Marcus caught Alina's arm in a grip that was gentle but desperate. "You don't have to do this," he whispered urgently. "I can order her to stand down, assert alpha authority." But Alina shook her head, feeling more like herself than she had since awakening in that dark cave. "Yes, I do," she replied. "They need to know I'm not just some broken thing you're protecting out of misplaced guilt. And honestly, I need to know it too." The makeshift fighting circle was roughly 20 feet in diameter, marked by pack members who stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes reflecting the firelight as they watched the two women prepare to face each other. Alina stripped off the outer layers of clothing that would impede movement, leaving herself in just a simple tunic and pants that allowed for full range of motion. Across from her, Alina was doing the same, revealing a body that was all lean muscle and battle-tested scars. The woman moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of combat, and Alina felt a flutter of doubt despite her earlier confidence. "No shifting," Alina called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the cavern. "No claws, no fangs. Human form only, hand-to-hand combat until one of us yields or cannot continue." The rules were fair, designed to test skill rather than raw animal power, but Alina couldn't help wondering if she was walking into a trap. How much of her fighting ability had survived the trauma that had stolen her memories? As if reading her thoughts, Elena's expression softened slightly. "Don't worry, Alina. I'm not here to kill you, just to see if the legendary warrior I once knew is still in there somewhere." The comment sparked something deep in Alina's mind, a flash of recognition that suggested these two women had history beyond the current conflict. The fight began without ceremony or countdown. Alina simply moved, flowing forward with lethal grace that spoke of decades of training and experience. Alina's body responded before her mind could fully process the attack, muscle memory guiding her into a defensive stance that deflected Alina's opening strike and countered with a move that was pure instinct. The clash sent both women reeling apart, and Alina felt a surge of something that might have been relief or recognition. Whatever else had been stolen from her, her warrior's training remained intact, written too deeply in bone and sinew to be erased by trauma. Alina's eyes lit up with something that might have been approval as she reset her stance and came again, this time with a combination of strikes that tested Alina's reflexes and footwork. The two women moved in a deadly dance, trading blows and counters with a skill that gradually drew appreciative murmurs from the watching pack. Alina found herself remembering fragments, not of specific fights, but of the feeling of combat, the joy of testing herself against a worthy opponent, the satisfaction of perfect technique executed under pressure. Each exchange brought back a little more of who she had been, the confident woman who had stood against tradition and fought for what she believed in. As the fight progressed, Alina began to understand that this was about more than proving her worth to Alina or the pack. Each strike and counterstrike was peeling away layers of doubt and confusion, revealing the core of who she was beneath the trauma and lost memories. She wasn't just Marcus's mate or a murderer or a woman broken by torture. She was a warrior, someone who had trained and fought and earned her place through skill and determination. The knowledge filled her with a fierce joy that transformed her movements, adding power and precision to techniques that were already formidable. Alina seemed to sense the change, her own movements becoming more aggressive as she pressed Alina harder, forcing her to dig deeper into reserves of skill and strength. But instead of overwhelming her, the increased pressure only served to unlock more of Alina's abilities. She found herself anticipating Alina's attacks, reading the subtle shifts in posture and breathing that telegraphed the other woman's intentions. When Alina overextended on a particularly ambitious combination, Alina was ready, slipping inside her guard and landing a series of strikes that sent the scarred warrior stumbling backward. The watching pack erupted in surprised cheers, but Alina barely heard them. She was too focused on the feeling of her true self finally emerging from the wreckage of her stolen memories. The fight ended abruptly when Alina raised her hand in the universal gesture of submission, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "Enough," she gasped, a smile spreading across her face despite the bruises already forming on her skin. "I yield. The Alina I remember is definitely still in there." The formal concession sent a wave of excitement through the watching pack, but Alina barely noticed. She was staring at Alina with growing recognition, fragments of memory clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their proper positions. "I trained you," Alina said suddenly, the words emerging from some deep well of recovered knowledge. "When you first joined the pack, when you were young and angry and didn't know how to channel your rage into something useful." Alina nodded, her expression softening with something that might have been affection. "You saved my life in more ways than one," she admitted. "Taught me that strength without discipline was just violence, that true warriors fought to protect rather than to dominate." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications that Alina was only beginning to understand. She had been more than just Marcus's reluctant mate. She had been a teacher, a mentor, someone others looked up to and learned from. As Alina and Alina caught their breath, other pack members began approaching, their expressions ranging from newfound respect to cautious curiosity. The successful defense of herself had clearly shifted something in the group dynamic, but Alina sensed there were still deeper currents of resentment and mistrust to navigate. "I remember teaching you the spiral defense," she said to Alina, more memories surfacing like bubbles rising to the surface of still water. "You had trouble with the footwork at first, kept getting tangled up in your own movements." Alina laughed, the sound genuine and warm despite the circumstances. "You made me practice it 1,000 times against that old oak tree until I could do it in my sleep." More fragments were returning now, triggered by physical exertion and emotional intensity. Alina could see faces in her mind, younger versions of some of the wolves who now watched her with such complicated expressions. She had been their teacher, their guide, someone who had helped shape them into the warriors they'd become. The knowledge was both empowering and devastating, because it meant her fall from grace had affected not just Marcus and herself, but everyone who had looked up to her. "I failed you all," she said quietly, the words carrying across the suddenly silent cavern. "Not just through betrayal or murder, but by abandoning everything I'd taught you about honor and loyalty and fighting for what's right rather than what feels good." Marcus stepped forward, his expression pained as he watched Alina grapple with the returning memories. "You weren't yourself toward the end," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The pressure of the arranged bond, the political maneuvering, the constant battle between what your heart wanted and what duty demanded, it changed you, made you desperate." But Alina shook her head, unwilling to accept excuses for actions she was beginning to remember with crystal clarity. The woman she had been hadn't just fallen in love with David Sterling. She had used him, manipulated his genuine feelings for her own purposes, and when Marcus had threatened to expose their relationship, she had chosen murder over facing the consequences of her choices. "I was weak," she said, the admission tasting like ash in her mouth. "I let my own desires matter more than the lives I was responsible for protecting. I became exactly the kind of leader I'd always fought against, someone who put personal wants above the good of those who trusted them." The pack members shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such brutal self-honesty from someone in a position of power. But Alina stepped forward, her scarred face serious but not unkind. "Weakness isn't falling down," she said firmly. "Weakness is staying down once you realize you've made a mistake. The question is, what are you going to do with the knowledge of who you were and who you became?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Alina felt the weight of dozens of gazes upon her as she considered her response. She could retreat back into the safety of lost memories, pretend that the returning fragments were too painful to bear, and let Marcus continue protecting her from the consequences of her past. Or she could face the truth fully, accept responsibility for her actions, and try to become someone worthy of the second chance she'd been given. The choice seemed obvious, but she knew that the path of accountability would be far more dangerous than the comfort of willful ignorance. "I want to remember everything," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the cavern. "All of it, the good and the bad, the choices I made and the prices others paid for them. I can't begin to make amends until I fully understand what I've done wrong." Marcus's expression tightened, and she could see him struggling with the instinct to protect her from painful truths. "The memories may not all return," he warned. "And even if they do, some truths are better left buried." But Alina had made her decision, and she could feel strength flowing back into her as she embraced the difficult path ahead. "Maybe," she acknowledged, "but I'd rather face hard truths than live in comfortable lies. If I'm going to earn a place among these wolves, if I'm going to be worthy of the sacrifices they've made, I need to know exactly who I'm trying to become." Sage was less than enthusiastic about Alina's decision to actively pursue her lost memories. The elderly healer paced around her small chamber, herb bundles hanging from the ceiling casting strange shadows in the flickering candlelight as she muttered about foolish wolves and dangerous paths. "Memory restoration isn't like healing a broken bone," she explained, her weathered hands gesturing emphatically. "The mind protects itself for good reasons. Trauma barriers exist to keep us functional, to prevent the soul from being overwhelmed by experiences too terrible to process." "But they're my experiences," Alina argued, sitting cross-legged on the fur-covered examination table. "My choices, my mistakes, my responsibility to bear. How can I make amends for actions I can't remember? How can I change patterns I can't see?" Sage fixed her with a sharp look that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. "And if the memories destroy you? If remembering turns you back into the desperate, broken woman who chose murder over facing consequences? What good will that do anyone?" The question was valid, but Alina had already weighed the risks and found them acceptable. She had tasted enough of her true self during the fight with Alina to know that somewhere beneath the trauma and confusion lay a person of strength and principle, someone worth fighting to reclaim. Despite her reservations, Sage eventually agreed to help with the memory restoration, though she insisted on certain precautions. "We'll do this gradually," the healer explained as she prepared a complex mixture of herbs and oils. "Small sessions carefully monitored, with Marcus present to anchor you if the memories become too overwhelming." The ritual itself was unlike anything Alina had expected. No dramatic ceremonies or mystical incantations, just Sage's gentle hands on her temples and the gradual relaxation that came from breathing in the carefully prepared mixture of scents. The first session brought back fragments of her childhood, running through moonlit forests with other young wolves, learning to hunt and fight and navigate the complex social hierarchies of pack life. But even these seemingly innocent memories carried shadows of what was to come. Alina could see herself as a young woman, already chafing against the restrictions placed on females, already questioning why strength and intelligence meant less than bloodline and political connections. "You were never going to be content with a traditional role," Sage observed as Alina emerged from the trance-like state. "Even as a child, you pushed boundaries, asked uncomfortable questions, refused to accept that things were the way they were simply because they'd always been that way." The next session delved deeper into Alina's youth, revealing the girl who had refused to accept limitations based on gender or status. She saw herself at 14, challenging male wolves twice her size to combat trials, winning through skill and determination rather than raw strength. She remembered the pride on her father's face when she defeated the son of a neighboring alpha, and the uncomfortable silence that had followed when the other pack demanded she be disciplined for showing up their heir. "You made enemies early," Marcus observed when she described the memory to him later. "Your refusal to know your place threatened wolves who had built their entire identity around being superior to females." But the memories also revealed unexpected allies. Wolves like Alina who had seen Alina's strength and been inspired by it, older females who had quietly supported her challenges to tradition even when they couldn't openly defy the system themselves. Alina began to understand that her eventual fall from grace hadn't happened in a vacuum. It had been the culmination of years of building tension between her vision of what their world could be and the reality of what it was. "I was fighting a war," she realized during one particularly intense session. Not just against specific wolves or rules, but against an entire way of thinking that kept half our population subordinate and powerless. The memory of learning about her arranged mating to Marcus hit Alina like a physical blow, bringing back the rage and despair she'd felt when her parents announced their decision. She had been 18, already establishing herself as a formidable warrior and strategic thinker, when she discovered that her future had been decided without her input or consent. The political advantages were clear: uniting two powerful packs, strengthening territorial borders, creating alliances that would benefit both groups for generations. But the personal cost had been devastating for a young woman who had already begun to envision a different kind of life. "I fought it," Alina remembered, her voice hollow as she described the scene to Marcus and Sage. "I argued, I pleaded. I threatened to leave the pack entirely rather than be traded like a piece of property. But pack law was clear. Children obeyed their parents, and mates were chosen for the good of the community, not for personal preference or romantic attachment." Marcus flinched as she spoke, clearly remembering his own role in the arrangement. He had been 25 to her 18, already established as his father's heir, and while he hadn't initiated the arrangement, he hadn't opposed it either. "I thought," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that would explain without excusing. "I thought you would come to care for me in time. I thought respect and partnership could grow into love." The memory of her wedding day was among the most painful Alina had recovered so far. She could see herself standing in the great hall of Marcus's pack house, wearing a dress that felt like a funeral shroud, speaking vows that tasted like poison on her tongue. The ceremony had been elaborate and beautiful, attended by hundreds of wolves from both packs, but all Alina had been able to think about was the cage being built around her with every word spoken. She had looked into Marcus's eyes as they exchanged the ritual bindings and seen genuine affection there, which had somehow made everything worse. At least cruelty would have been honest. "I tried to make it work," Alina whispered, tears flowing freely as the memories overwhelmed her. "For the first year I really tried. I performed the role of dutiful mate, supported your decisions, played the part of the perfect Luna." But even as she spoke the words, she could remember the growing resentment that had poisoned every interaction, the way small compromises had accumulated into a crushing weight of suppressed identity. Marcus had been kind, respectful, even affectionate in his way, but he had also been the living symbol of everything that had been taken from her. Her choice, her autonomy, her right to determine her own destiny. The memories of her first years as Marcus's mate revealed a slow, steady erosion of the woman she had been. Alina watched through the lens of recovered experience as she gradually stopped challenging unfair decisions if they didn't directly affect her, stopped speaking up in pack meetings when her voice might contradict Marcus's authority, stopped training younger wolves who might benefit from her unconventional approaches to combat and strategy. The vibrant, defiant girl she had been was slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations and compromise. "I became someone I didn't recognize," Alina told Sage during one particularly difficult session. "Someone who smiled and nodded and played her part while dying a little more inside each day. And the worst part was that Marcus never demanded it of me. I did it to myself, convinced that if I could just be perfect enough, dutiful enough, maybe I could find some happiness in the life I'd been given." The healer nodded sadly, having seen the pattern before in other arranged matings. "Self-imposed cages are often stronger than those built by others," Sage observed. "Because we tell ourselves we're choosing our own chains, that we could break free if we really wanted to. But the result is the same: a slow strangulation of the soul until something breaks. The memory that surfaced next showed Alina the moment she had begun to push back against the suffocating expectations of her role. It had started small, speaking up during a pack meeting when Marcus proposed a punishment she felt was too harsh, questioning a decision to deny shelter to refugees from a pack torn apart by internal conflict. She could remember the shocked silence that had followed her first public disagreement with her mate, the way conversations had stopped and all eyes had turned to Marcus to see how he would handle his defiant Luna. To his credit, Marcus had listened to her concerns and even modified his position based on her arguments. But Alina could see in the recovered memory how uncomfortable he'd been with a public challenge, how he'd pulled her aside later to suggest that such disagreements might be better handled privately. "You weren't trying to control me," Alina realized as she described the scene to him. "You were trying to protect both of us from the political fallout of appearing divided. But it felt like control, like another chain being added to the ones already binding me." The distinction was important, but it didn't change the effect. Alina had begun to feel like her voice only mattered when it echoed her mate's opinions. The first memory of David Sterling hit Alina like lightning, bringing back not just the image of his face but the overwhelming rush of emotions she'd felt upon meeting him. He had been part of a diplomatic mission from the Northern Territories, younger than Marcus by several years, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had earned his position through merit rather than birthright. What had struck her immediately wasn't just his physical attractiveness, though he had been undeniably beautiful in the way of wolves who spent their lives in constant motion, but the intensity with which he listened when she spoke, as if her words mattered in a way they hadn't for years. "He saw me," Alina whispered, the memory so vivid she could almost smell the pine scent that had always clung to his skin. Not Marcus's mate, not the Alina of the pack, just me. When I talked about the changes I wanted to see in our world, he didn't patronize me or suggest I work through proper channels. He asked questions, built on my ideas, treated my opinions as if they had value independent of my political position. The contrast with her daily reality had been intoxicating, awakening parts of herself she'd thought were dead forever. For the first time in years, Alina had felt truly seen and appreciated for who she was rather than what role she played. The diplomatic mission had lasted 2 weeks, and Alina found herself looking forward to the daily meetings between the packs with an anticipation that should have warned her of the dangerous path she was walking. David had a way of catching her eye during formal discussions, a slight smile or raised eyebrow that suggested they were sharing some private joke about the pompous posturing of pack politics. When he spoke during negotiations, his words carried the passion of someone who genuinely believed in the possibility of creating a better world for all wolves, not just those fortunate enough to be born into power. "I told myself it was just intellectual appreciation," Alina admitted as the memories continued to flow. "That I was simply enjoying conversation with someone who shared my ideals and treated me as an equal. But I was lying to myself, and probably to him as well." The turning point had come during a private moment when David had approached her after a particularly frustrating council session where her suggestions for refugee aid had been dismissed without serious consideration. He had found her in the garden, staring up at the moon and trying to compose herself before returning to play the role of supportive mate. "You shouldn't have to hide your light," he had said simply. "The world needs wolves like you too much for you to pretend to be less than you are." The memory of their first kiss was so intense that Alina gasped aloud, her body responding to the phantom touch even as her rational mind recognized it as recovered experience rather than present reality. It had happened on the last night of the diplomatic mission, when David had sought her out one final time to say goodbye. They had been standing in the moonlight, talking about the changes they both hoped to see in the wolf world, when the conversation had gradually died away and left them staring at each other with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate with possibility. "I knew it was wrong," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew it would destroy everything if we were discovered. But in that moment, none of it mattered. For just a few seconds, I felt like the woman I was supposed to be instead of the shadow I'd become." The kiss had been everything she'd dreamed of and more, passionate but tender, desperate but reverent, carrying the weight of all the words they couldn't speak and all the futures they couldn't have. When they'd finally broken apart, both of them had been shaking, and Alina had seen her own anguish reflected in David's eyes. They both knew they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had tasted something that would make everything else seem pale and flavorless by comparison. What followed was a month of the most intense emotional experience of Alina's life, conducted entirely in secret through carefully coded messages and stolen moments when pack business provided legitimate reasons for contact. David would send word that his pack needed clarification on some minor treaty detail, and Alina would volunteer to handle the correspondence, giving her an excuse to write letters that contained their real communication hidden between lines of diplomatic language. When his pack sent delegations to trade gatherings or territorial meetings, she would find reasons to attend, and they would steal precious minutes together away from watching eyes. It was like living two completely different lives, Alina remembered, her voice carrying the echo of old pain and old joy. With Marcus and the pack, I played the role I'd perfected over years of marriage. Dutiful, supportive, careful never to rock the boat too hard. But with David, I could be the woman I'd always wanted to be. Passionate, opinionated, free to dream about changing the world instead of just surviving in it. The duality had been exhausting but intoxicating, like a drug that made everything else seem gray and lifeless by comparison. She had begun to live entirely for those stolen moments, counting the days between opportunities to see him and replaying every conversation, every touch, every shared glance until they were worn smooth by memory. The memory of the day Marcus discovered her affair was one of the most painful Alina had recovered yet. She could see herself returning from what she'd thought was a perfectly concealed meeting with David, still glowing with the happiness of their time together, only to find Marcus waiting in their private chambers with an expression of such devastation that it had stopped her cold. He hadn't ranted or raged. Instead, he'd simply held up one of her letters to David, the one where she'd let her guard down enough to write about how much she loved him and how she dreamed of a life where they could be together openly. "How long?" Marcus had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina could remember the way her heart had hammered against her ribs as she'd realized there was no point in denial, no way to explain away the damning evidence in his hands. 3 months, she'd admitted, the words falling like stones into the silence of their room. Marcus had closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he'd opened them again, she'd seen something die behind his gaze, some last hope or illusion that their marriage might still be salvaged. "Do you love him?" he'd asked, and Alina had known that her answer would determine everything that followed. "Yes," Alina had whispered in response to Marcus's question, the single word carrying the weight of everything she'd hidden and everything she'd sacrificed. "I love him more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." The admission had hit Marcus like a physical blow, and she'd watched him struggle to maintain his composure as the full implications of her betrayal sank in. For a long moment, they'd stood in silence, the ruins of their marriage scattered around them like broken glass, before Marcus had straightened and taken on the mantle of alpha authority that had always been his refuge in times of crisis. "You will end it," he had said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute command that brooked no argument. "You will send word to David Sterling that your association is over, and you will never contact him again. If you do this, if you can find a way to honor the bond between us, I won't reveal what has happened. The pack will never know of your betrayal, and we can try to rebuild what we once had." The offer had been more generous than Alina had had any right to expect, and she'd known that accepting it was the rational choice, the safe choice, the one that would protect everyone involved from the devastating consequences of exposure. But as she'd looked at Marcus's face, she'd realized that she couldn't make that promise, couldn't willingly return to the cage she'd finally found the courage to escape. "I can't," Alina had said, the words seeming to echo in the sudden stillness of their chamber. "I can't go back to pretending to be someone I'm not, can't spend the rest of my life playing a role that's killing me piece by piece." Marcus's face had gone pale, then flushed with a combination of rage and pain that had made him look like a stranger. "Then you're choosing him over everything we've built together," he'd said, his voice carrying a finality that had made Alina's wolf whine with distress. "Over the pack that has sheltered and protected you, over the bond that ties our souls together, over any hope of an honorable resolution to this situation." The accusation had stung because it was essentially true. Alina was choosing love over duty, personal happiness over political stability, her own desires over the needs of the community that had raised and shaped her. But as she'd stood there facing the wreckage of her marriage, she'd also felt a fierce joy at finally being honest about who she was and what she wanted. "I'm choosing truth," she'd replied, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I'm choosing to be the woman I was born to be instead of the shadow I've become. If that makes me selfish or treacherous or weak, then so be it. But I won't apologize for refusing to live a lie anymore." The memory of rushing to David's territory to tell him about Marcus's discovery was painful in an entirely different way from the confrontation with her mate. Alina could see herself arriving at the northern pack's border, desperate and disheveled from traveling at maximum speed, only to be told that David was away on pack business and wouldn't return for several days. The waiting had been agony, made worse by the growing certainty that Marcus wouldn't simply accept her defiance quietly. When David had finally returned and she'd been able to explain the situation, his reaction had been everything she'd hoped for and feared. "Come with me," he'd said immediately, his arms tightening around her as if he could physically protect her from the consequences bearing down on them. "Leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere far from both our packs. We'll build a new life together, away from all the politics and traditions that have kept us apart." The offer had been tempting beyond measure, but Alina had known even then that running away wouldn't solve anything. They would be rogues, outcasts without pack protection or support, constantly looking over their shoulders for pursuit. More importantly, abandoning her responsibilities would confirm every accusation Marcus might make about her character and fitness for leadership. Instead of fleeing, Alina had chosen to return to her pack and face whatever consequences awaited her, but not before making one final, fatal mistake. She had convinced David to meet her at the border between their territories, in a secluded grove that had become special to them during their secret courtship. Her plan had been to say goodbye properly, to end their relationship with dignity and clarity before submitting to whatever punishment Marcus deemed appropriate. But as she now remembered with crystal clarity, Marcus had been expecting exactly such a move, had been watching her every moment since their confrontation. "He was waiting for us," Alina whispered as the memory unfolded with devastating precision. "Hidden in the trees with 3 of his most trusted warriors, watching as David and I met for what we thought would be the last time." The scene played out in her mind like a nightmare. Herself and David holding each other desperately, speaking words of love and regret, when suddenly they were surrounded by wolves with eyes that glowed like coals in the darkness. Marcus had stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury, and Alina had known in that moment that she had walked both herself and David into a trap that would destroy them all. "Adultery," Marcus had said, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of an alpha pronouncing judgment. "Violation of the mate bond. Betrayal of pack loyalty. The evidence is clear, and the penalties prescribed by law are absolute." Alina had moved instinctively to place herself between David and the surrounding wolves, her own fighter's instincts awakening even as her heart hammered with terror. She had known the laws as well as Marcus did. Adultery by a mated female was punishable by death, and the male involved faced exile at best, execution at worst. But what had truly frightened her wasn't the prospect of her own punishment, but the look of cold calculation in Marcus's eyes as he'd stared at David. "The male dies tonight," Marcus had continued, and Alina had felt her world tilt sideways with the casual cruelty of his pronouncement. "The female will face judgment before the full pack council, as is her right as Luna. But her lover," the word had dripped with venom, "has no standing, no protection, no claim to mercy." David had stepped forward then, his own alpha instincts responding to the challenge despite the hopelessness of their situation. "If you want to punish someone, punish me alone," he'd said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Alina never asked for the bond that trapped her. If anyone deserves to pay for this, it's the one who knew better and pursued her anyway." What happened next was the memory Alina had been most afraid to recover, the moment that had transformed her from an adulterous wife into a murderer. As David had spoken, accepting responsibility and offering himself as the sole target for Marcus's rage, something had snapped inside Alina's mind. Not a rational decision but a primal response to seeing someone she loved threatened with death. She had moved without conscious thought, her hand finding the silver knife she always carried for protection, her body flowing into the attack patterns she'd spent years perfecting. The blade had taken Marcus's closest lieutenant in the throat before anyone could react, arterial blood painting the moonlit clearing crimson as the wolf dropped without a sound. In the chaos that followed, as the remaining wolves struggled to process what had just happened, Alina had grabbed David's hand and run, dragging him deeper into the forest while shouts of pursuit echoed behind them. But even as they'd fled through the darkness, she'd known that killing Marcus's man had sealed both their fates. There would be no mercy now, no chance for negotiation or clemency. She had crossed the line from adulteress to murderer, and the entire wolf world would be hunting them before dawn. The memory of their flight through the wilderness was a blur of desperate movement and growing despair. Alina could see herself and David running through the night, using every trick of woodcraft and survival she'd ever learned to stay ahead of their pursuers. But they both knew they were fighting a losing battle. Marcus had resources they couldn't match, allies who would help track them across any terrain, and the legal authority to call upon other packs for assistance in hunting down a murderer and her accomplice. "We should separate," David had argued during a brief rest in a cave that provided temporary shelter. "They're tracking both of us together. If we split up, at least one of us might have a chance to escape." But Alina had refused, clinging to him with a desperation that had surprised them both. After years of feeling isolated and alone even in the midst of her pack, the thought of voluntarily separating from the one person who truly understood her had been unbearable. They had wasted precious time debating, time that might have made the difference between escape and capture, before finally agreeing to stay together and face whatever came as a united front. Their capture had come on the third day of flight, when exhaustion and hunger had finally slowed them enough for Marcus's hunting party to close the distance. Alina remembered the moment when they'd realized they were surrounded, trapped in a rocky canyon with no way out except through the wolves who blocked their path. David had tried one last time to convince her to save herself, offering to create a distraction that might give her a chance to escape, but Alina had known it was too late for heroic gestures or noble sacrifices. "Together," she had said, taking his hand as they'd faced the closing circle of their enemies. "Whatever happens, we face it together." The words had been both a promise and a farewell, because they'd both known there was no scenario where this ended with anything but death. Marcus had appeared at the mouth of the canyon, his face carved from granite, flanked by wolves whose eyes held no mercy or compassion. "Surrender now," he had called, "and I promise David Sterling will die quickly and cleanly. Continue to resist, and I'll make sure he suffers for every moment of pain you've caused me." What Alina remembered next was the most devastating revelation yet, the moment when love had transformed into something darker and more terrible than hate. As she'd stood facing Marcus's ultimatum, as she'd seen the hopelessness of their situation and the certainty of David's death, something had broken inside her mind. Not the clean break of madness or despair, but the slow, twisted fracture of someone choosing evil over helplessness. If David was going to die anyway, if there was no way to save him or preserve what they'd shared, then perhaps she could at least control the manner of his ending. The silver knife had moved before conscious thought, sliding between David's ribs with the precision of someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage. He'd looked at her with shocked understanding in the moment before the light faded from his eyes, recognizing what she'd done and perhaps even why she'd done it. "Better to die by my hand than his," she'd whispered against his ear as he'd collapsed in her arms. "At least this way, no one else gets to decide how our story ends." The words had been meant as comfort, but even as she'd spoken them, Alina had known she was trying to justify the unjustifiable, to transform murder into mercy through pure force of will. The memory of Marcus's reaction to David's death was burned into Alina's mind with perfect, terrible clarity. He had stared at the scene before him, his wife holding her dead lover, blood on her hands and madness in her eyes, and for a moment, his mask of control had slipped entirely. What she'd seen beneath wasn't anger or satisfaction, but something that might have been grief, as if her final betrayal had killed something essential inside him as well. "You're right," he'd said finally, his voice hollow and strange. "You get to decide how this story ends. But the epilogue belongs to me." The journey back to pack territory had been conducted in absolute silence. Alina bound with silver chains that burned her skin but couldn't compare to the agony burning inside her soul. She had killed the only person who had ever truly loved her, had destroyed the one pure thing in her life with her own hands, and the worst part was that she couldn't entirely regret it. Death by her hand had been kinder than whatever tortures Marcus might have devised, and at least David had died knowing she loved him enough to spare him worse suffering. But the knowledge that she was capable of such calculated violence, even for love, had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of herself. The pack trial had been a formality, the outcome predetermined by laws older than anyone could remember. Alina stood before the assembled wolves, no longer the respected Alina they had once known but something altogether more dangerous and unpredictable. She had admitted her guilt without hesitation or excuse, describing her actions with a clinical detachment that had unsettled even her judges. "I committed adultery," she had said, her voice carrying clearly across the packed hall. "I violated the sacred bond of mating. And when faced with the consequences of my choices, I chose murder over accountability." The pack's reaction had been a mixture of horror, fascination, and something that might have been fear. This wasn't the broken, penitent woman they had expected to see. This was someone who had looked into the abyss of her own soul and found it acceptable. When Marcus had pronounced the sentence of death, Alina had simply nodded, as if execution were just another item on a list of daily tasks. But then she had done something that surprised everyone, including herself. She had asked to speak, to explain not her actions but her motivations, to make the pack understand why she had chosen love over loyalty and murder over mercy. "I will not ask for forgiveness," Alina had said, her voice carrying the authority she had once wielded as Marcus's mate and partner. "I will not claim that love justifies betrayal, or that passion excuses murder. What I did was wrong by every law and custom we hold sacred, and I accept the consequences without complaint or appeal." The words had fallen like stones into the shocked silence of the great hall, and Alina had felt a strange peace descending over her as she'd prepared to speak the truth that had been burning inside her for years. "But I will not apologize for refusing to live a lie," she had continued, her gaze moving across the faces of wolves who had once respected and followed her. "I will not pretend that duty matters more than authenticity, or that traditions deserve respect simply because they are old. You are about to kill me for choosing love over law, but I have been dying slowly for years under the weight of expectations I never agreed to bear." The words had hit their mark. She could see it in the uncomfortable shifting of the crowd, the way eyes had dropped to avoid her gaze. These wolves knew what she was talking about, had seen the slow strangulation of her spirit under the demands of her role, but none of them had been willing to challenge a system that benefited them all. Through all of this, Marcus had stood like a statue, his face carved from stone as he'd listened to his mate's final testimony. But Alina could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between his love for her and his duty to the pack, between mercy and justice, between the man who had genuinely cared for her and the alpha who couldn't show weakness in front of his wolves. When she had finished speaking and taken her seat to await execution, he had surprised everyone by calling for a recess, disappearing into his private chambers for what felt like hours. The recess felt like a death sentence to Alina. She sat motionless, the weight of her confession still heavy on her chest. The air in the hall was thick with tension, the murmur of the pack members rising and falling like a distant storm. Her heart beat in time with the distant drums of fate. She had spoken the truth, and now the world she had once known was slipping through her fingers, piece by piece. She felt Marcus's absence like a gaping wound. His silence was more than just a lack of words. It was a chasm, a space between them that no amount of love or regret could bridge. How had they come to this? The man who had once been her mate, her partner, her protector, now stood on the other side of justice, his duty pulling him away from the very bond that had once seemed unbreakable. When Marcus returned, it was with a look that told Alina everything she needed to know. His expression was unreadable, his eyes devoid of the warmth she had once relied on. The alpha within him had fully taken control, leaving no room for the man who had once loved her. "Pack," Marcus said, his voice cold and authoritative, The trial has ended. Alina Ashworth has confessed to her crimes, and the punishment will be carried out. Alina's heart sank. She had expected this, of course. The law demanded it. But hearing it from Marcus, hearing the finality in his voice, made it real in a way nothing else could. However, Marcus continued, and for the briefest moment, Alina thought she saw a flicker of the man she had once known. I will grant her a final request. The pack was silent, and Alina felt the weight of every gaze upon her. The words she had spoken earlier still rang in her ears, and for a moment, she wondered if she had truly chosen the right path. But there was no turning back now. Marcus turned his gaze on her, and though his eyes were as hard as stone, there was a depth of sorrow there that she had never expected to see. Alina Ashworth, he said softly. Your request. Alina stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She could feel the cold stone beneath her feet, the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. She had one chance, one final moment to speak her truth. She took a deep breath and faced the pack. I ask for mercy, she said, her voice carrying across the cavern. Not for myself, but for those who followed me, for those who sacrificed everything to save me. The pack has lost enough. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can ensure that my death does not destroy what remains of my people. Let the pack decide my fate. A murmur ran through the wolves, their eyes darting to one another in silent counsel. Marcus stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. Then let the pack decide, he said, and with a single motion, he gestured for the wolves to gather. The pack council had always been a sacred ritual, a place where the Alpha's word held the power of law, and yet, in this moment, Alina knew it was different. The weight of the pack's collective gaze was crushing, the scrutiny of her every choice, every action, bearing down on her as if it were her last. The council was called to order, the ancient traditions of the pack still in place despite the turmoil that had shaken their foundation. One by one the wolves spoke, their voices a chorus of conflicting emotions. Some had once followed her, trusted her judgment, and now they were torn. Others still saw her as a traitor, a threat to their survival. Alina's heart raced as each wolf stood and offered their opinion. Some spoke of justice, of the law that demanded her death. Others spoke of loyalty to Marcus, and the sacrifice he had made for her. But the final voice, the voice that mattered most, came from Alina. I have fought alongside Alina. I have bled with her. And I have seen her change, not just because of betrayal, but because of the choices she made to follow her heart, Alina said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. She may have broken the laws, but she was never the monster they paint her to be. She was a warrior, a leader, and if we cannot offer her forgiveness, then we are no better than the tyrants we claim to fight. The room fell silent. Elena's words were a challenge, a plea for mercy that resonated deep within the pack. The wolves looked between Alina and Marcus, the decision hanging in the air. After a long pause, Marcus spoke. The pack has spoken. Alina Ashworth will be exiled, not executed. She will leave our lands and never return. Let her go and find redemption outside these walls. It was the mercy Alina had hoped for but never truly expected. She stood there, numb, as the weight of her exile settled around her like a shroud. She was free from death, but in some ways she had lost everything. The next few days were a blur of preparations. Alina packed what little she could carry, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she was leaving behind the pack that had once been her home. She said her goodbyes quietly, offering no explanations, no apologies. The wolves who had once followed her now turned their backs, and though Alina stood by her, it was clear that Alina's path was one she would walk alone. As she left the pack's territory, the weight of her decisions began to sink in. She had chosen love, chosen her own heart over duty. But what had it cost her? She had betrayed Marcus, broken the sacred bond of their mating, and for what? A fleeting moment of freedom, a chance to be who she had always wanted to be. The world outside the pack's borders was vast, and Alina was unsure of where to go or what to do. But one thing was certain, she would never stop searching for redemption. The road ahead was long, but it was hers to walk. Alina traveled far from the only life she had ever known. Her heart heavy with loss but also lighter than it had been in years. She found herself in a distant land, where wolves lived under different rules, where power wasn't determined by bloodlines but by strength of will. It was there that Alina began to rebuild, not just her life but her identity. She became a warrior once more, training with those who valued skill over status. She found a purpose in the fight for equality, a cause she had once fought for but had lost sight of in the midst of betrayal and politics. But even as she forged a new path, her heart never truly healed. She still dreamed of Marcus, still wondered what might have been had their love not been torn apart by the laws of their pack. She knew she would never return to the life she had left behind, but part of her would always be bound to it, to him. Years passed, and Alina became known as a fierce leader, a wolf who had faced the consequences of her actions and emerged stronger for it. She led with wisdom and compassion, but the memories of her past never fully left her. She often found herself staring at the moon, wondering if Marcus still thought of her, wondering if he had ever truly forgiven her. One night, as she stood at the edge of a new pack's territory, a familiar presence filled the air. She turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a tall, powerful alpha with eyes that burned with the same intensity she remembered. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable. "Alina," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years gone by. And in that moment, Alina knew that while their paths had diverged, their bond would never truly be broken. The love they had once shared might have been shattered, but in its place was something stronger, something that neither time nor distance could erase. Marcus spoke first. "I've come to offer you something," he said. "Not forgiveness, not a return to what we once were, but a future where we both can live free from the past." Alina's heart raced as she listened. Was this a chance to heal, to rebuild what they had lost? Or was it another promise that would only lead to more pain? "You don't have to decide now," Marcus continued. "But know that I will always be here, waiting for you to make the choice that is best for you." Alina stood there, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. For the first time in years, she felt hope stir within her. "I'm not the same wolf I was before," she said, her voice steady. "But I am willing to try again. Not for you, not for the pack, but for me." And so, Alina Ashworth took her first step forward into a future she had longed for, one where her past no longer defined her, and her heart was free to choose its own path. The years that followed were not easy, but they were filled with hope. Alina and Marcus rebuilt their relationship slowly, not as Alpha and Luna, but as two wolves who had both been scarred by the past but were determined to find a way forward together. Their love was different now, wiser, stronger, and more enduring because it was no longer built on the bonds of law or duty, but on mutual respect and understanding. They ruled not as master and servant, but as equals, partners in every sense of the word. And so, the story of Alina Ashworth, the wolf who had once lost everything, ended not with death or betrayal, but with redemption. She had fought for her future, and in doing so, had found a love that was truly her own. As Alina and Marcus stood together, watching the sun set over their new home, Alina realized that her journey had not been one of betrayal and loss, but one of discovery. She had discovered the strength to stand alone, the courage to face the truth, and the power to rebuild from the ashes of her past. And in that moment, she knew that the story of the forgotten mate was only the beginning.